F1 legends explain how terrifying Alain Prost really was. Ayrton Senna was not afraid of anything. He drove into walls at 180 miles per hour and called it God's will. He said death was simply a consequence he had accepted. He walked into rooms that silenced grown men. And yet, there was one man in Formula One who made Ayrton Senna uncomfortable. Not angry, not competitive, uncomfortable. Here's what the history books tell you about Alain Prost. 4 world championships, 51 race wins, the most calculated driver in the history of the sport. They called him the Professor. And that nickname, that warm, academic little nickname, is exactly how Prost wanted you to see him. Because while everyone was watching Senna's genius, Prost was running a war that most people didn't even know had started. Niki Lauda, 3-time world champion, a man who drove back onto a racetrack 14 days after his face had been burned to the bone, said this about Prost: "Alain was the most complete driver I ever saw. But more than that, he was the most dangerous man in the paddock. Not because of what he did on track, because of what he did off it." Let's go back to 1984. Prost is already a 2-time world champion, polished, respected, beloved by the press. Then McLaren signs a young Brazilian kid with fire in his eyes and God on his lips. And something shifts, not on the track, not yet, in the air between them. Most people frame the Senna-Prost rivalry as 2 geniuses racing each other. That's the surface story. The real story is what Prost was doing between the races. See, Senna drove on feeling, on God, on instinct and raw, burning talent. Prost drove on information. He was the first driver in Formula One history to treat the debrief as seriously as the race itself. Hours. Sometimes 4 or 5 hours with the engineers after every single session, not just reviewing data, weaponizing it. Ron Dennis, the McLaren team principal who built that dynasty from the ground up, described Prost this way: "Alain could feel things in the car that our sensors couldn't even measure, and then he'd come in and explain it with the precision of an engineer. It was almost inhuman. But here's what made it terrifying. Prost didn't just use that information to make himself faster. He used it to make you doubt yourself." Former McLaren engineer Steve Nichols put it plainly. Alain would walk into a debrief, sit down, and within 10 minutes, the entire team's focus had shifted toward his car. Not because he demanded it, because the quality of his feedback made it inevitable. Ayrton saw it happening, and it drove him absolutely mad. That's the thing about Prost that the cameras never caught. He didn't need to intimidate you. He just needed to be better at the game you didn't know you were playing. In 1988, McLaren produced arguably the most dominant car in Formula One history, the MP4-4. It won 15 out of 16 races, and it had 2 of the greatest drivers ever made, sitting in identical machinery. So what happened? Prost started losing. Not by much, not dramatically. But Senna was pulling ahead in the championship, race by race. And this is where most people think the story ends. Senna was simply faster. But watch what Prost does next. He doesn't panic. He doesn't push harder. He doesn't confront Senna. He plants a seed. In press conferences, quietly, methodically, Prost begins suggesting, never directly, always gently, that the team favors Senna. That the dynamic isn't equal. That something isn't entirely fair. Martin Brundle, who raced against both men and has spent 30 years analyzing them, said, "Alain was a master of the narrative. He never accused anyone. He just asked questions. Innocent questions that made everyone in the room start looking sideways at each other." By the end of 1988, Senna had the championship. But Prost had already won the next war, because by January of 1989, the entire paddock was watching McLaren differently. The trust was cracked, and Prost hadn't thrown a single punch. October 22nd, 1989. Japanese Grand Prix. Suzuka. Senna needs to win to keep his championship alive. Prost needs to finish in front of Senna. Everything comes down to this race, on this track, between these two men who have spent 2 years dismantling each other in ways the sport has never seen before or since. They collide at the chicane. And what happens in the next 30 seconds tells you everything you need to know about Alain Prost. He climbs out of his car. Slowly. Deliberately. He doesn't look at Senna's car. He doesn't look back at the track. He walks away from the wreckage with the calm of a man who has already decided what happens next. Senna gets his car restarted. He wins the race. And then the FIA disqualifies him. Now, here's the detail that gets buried in every mainstream retelling of this story. That same year, Prost had taken a formal position within the FIA's Drivers' Commission. He had built relationships at the highest levels of the sport's governing body. Relationships that Senna, who treated politics the way he treated caution flags, simply did not have. Was the disqualification influenced by those relationships? No one has ever proven it. But Gerhard Berger, Senna's teammate, his closest friend in the paddock, the man who sat beside him in more hotel lobbies and airport lounges than anyone else, said this: Senna would fight you on the track. Prost would fight you everywhere else. And everywhere else is a much bigger battlefield. That's not an accusation. That's an autopsy. After 1989, Senna went public in a way he never had before. He said things in interviews that were raw, unfiltered, almost desperate. He called the disqualification a scandal. He called the politics corrupt. He named names in ways that shocked a sport that had always conducted its warfare quietly. And then he said something that, if you understand Formula One, stops you completely cold. I have never felt that a racing driver could be my enemy. But Prost made me understand that the race is only part of the competition. Read that carefully. Senna. The man who said God sat beside him in the cockpit, who described qualifying laps as a form of spiritual transcendence, admitted that Prost had expanded the definition of the battlefield into territory that Senna didn't know how to navigate. This wasn't about lap times anymore. This was about power. Institutional power. Political power. The kind of power that doesn't show up in the timesheets and doesn't care how fast you can take a corner in the rain. And Prost had been playing that game since before Senna had his first podium. 3-time world champion Jackie Stewart said it without any decoration. Alain understood that Formula One is not just a sport. It's a political organization with cars attached. He mastered both. That's why he has 4 championships. Here's the part of the Prost story that almost nobody tells. By 1992, Prost is gone. He'd walked away from Formula One, retired, done. Then Williams comes calling with the best car on the grid. The FW15C, with active suspension so advanced it essentially drove itself to the limit. The most technologically dominant machine the sport had ever produced. Prost comes back, and he wins the championship. Clinically, without drama. With a control and efficiency that made the rest of the field look like they were racing in a different era. But here's what makes that 1993 season genuinely chilling. The Williams contract, negotiated by Prost himself, contained a clause that blocked the team from signing Senna as his teammate. Think about that. The man who 4 years earlier had been accused of running a political war against Senna didn't just compete with him on the track. He engineered a situation where Senna couldn't even get into the same garage. He didn't want to race him. Not because he couldn't beat him on a given Sunday, but because removing the variable entirely, before qualifying, before the first lap of the first race, that was the more efficient outcome. And efficiency was always the point. Damon Hill, who was Prost's teammate that year and watched him operate every single day, said, Alain didn't waste anything. Not fuel, not tires, not effort, not emotion. He was the most economical human being I've ever met in my life. Everything had a purpose. That word, economical, is the key to understanding Prost completely, because economical means never spending more than necessary to achieve the result. It means knowing what the result is before you start spending. It means the race, the press conference, the debrief, the contract negotiation, the political relationship, the carefully worded suggestion in a press conference. All of it is the same calculation, running simultaneously, all the time. Senna burned, Prost calculated. And calculation, run long enough, at high enough precision, wins. May 1st, 1994. Imola, Italy. Ayrton Senna dies on the Tamburello corner at 190 miles per hour. Alain Prost had retired at the end of 1993. He was at Imola that weekend as a guest of the Williams team, watching from the pit wall. When the news came through, when it became clear that there was no good outcome, that the man who had been his greatest rival and his most complicated relationship was gone, Prost turned away from the cameras, and he wept, not for the broadcast, not for the press, not as a performance of grief for an audience. He turned away because, for once, there was no calculation. There was no next move. There was no version of this that could be managed or positioned or narratively controlled. There was just the loss of the only man who had ever truly understood what Prost was doing, because Senna was the only one who had felt the full weight of it directed at him. What Senna said publicly was that Prost was his greatest rival. What the people closest to him confirmed, quietly, over the years, was something slightly different. Prost was the only man Senna studied, not admired, not envied, not feared in the way that word usually means. Studied. The way you study something that you suspect might be operating at a level you haven't fully mapped yet. The way you study something you're not entirely sure you can defeat through the means you're most comfortable with. 4 world championships, 51 race wins, a rivalry that rewrote the rules of what competition in Formula One could look like. And an opponent, arguably the greatest racing driver who ever lived, who admitted, in so many words, that Prost had taken the game somewhere he wasn't prepared to follow. Everyone remembers Senna as the legend. And he was. He absolutely was. But the next time you watch the 1988 or 1989 season, watch Prost. Watch his hands during the debrief. Watch his eyes in the press conference. Watch who he speaks to in the paddock and who he strategically, deliberately never acknowledges at all. Watch the man who made the most dangerous driver in the history of the sport admit that the race was only part of the competition. The professor didn't just teach Formula One. He was the exam that no one passed. The 1989 Japanese Grand Prix is the most politically complex race in Formula One history. Every move that led to Senna's disqualification, the relationships, the timing, the decision chain inside the FIA, the full breakdown is linked right here.